Okay. Hi, everybody. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet and the Bejigal people of the Eora Nation on whose land I have the privilege of living and working, and pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge that the sovereignty of that land has never been ceded, and extend my respect to any Indigenous people who are here today. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me to speak today, Texa. It's really fantastic to be here. I'm going to start by, is this actually going to work? No. How do I do this? Oh, I'm in your world, Anthony. Does this do anything? No. What am I? I'm looking at you.
Point and shoot.
Point at shoot. Point where? At you? Hey, there we go. Excellent. Okay, I'm going to start with there we go. Oh gosh, all organised. Let's start again. Hi everybody. I'm going to start with some definitions just so we're clear about what I'm talking about today. When we talk about academic integrity, really, we're talking about two subsets, which is educational integrity, in other words, how we teach students to develop practices of academic integrity, and then, of course, research integrity, which is what they need to demonstrate once they are practising researcher and once, obviously, what we need to uphold as practising researchers. But really, to talk about my experiences, where am I pointing this? There we go, that'll do. The way that we talk about educational integrity is really important, and I'll give you an example of a class that I actually run with some engineering students. When I was asked to help work with the engineering students to help them understand what academic integrity is, I thought structural integrity, that'll help them get their heads around what academic integrity is. So I found this great definition on Wikipedia and I started working with it with them. And basically it says structural integrity is the ability of an item to hold together under a load, including its own weight, without breaking or deforming excessively. It assures that the construction will perform its designed function during reasonable use for as long as its intended lifespan, and items are constructed with structural integrity to prevent catastrophic failure, which can result in injuries, severe damage, death, and or monetary losses. And I put it to the students, basically, see if I can get this to go. Do you have structural integrity? Have a think about it. Do you have the ability of you as an item to hold together under load, in other words, the study that you are doing, including your own weight, that's the pressures you're under as a person, as a student, as a son, a daughter, somebody who needs to eat and sleep, without breaking or deforming excessively. The construction will perform its designed function. Will you be a good graduate, a professional, during reasonable use, in other words, what you're going to be asked to do as a dentist or a doctor or an engineer, for as long as your intended lifespan, in other words, your career. And then I talk to them about catastrophic failure and help them to think about the difference between academic failure and catastrophic failure. What if, as a professional in the world of work, your failures, because you are unable to do your work properly as a student, mean that you actually cause injury or death through a poorly designed bridge, for instance? So it really seemed to resonate with the students. But today I'm going to ask, what about us? Do we have structural integrity as an industry? And that's what I want to go on to talk about today, because ultimately, integrity should be at the heart of everything that we do in higher education. And it should be more than just what we say we do. It should be what we actually do. And I ask you all to go back and do a word search through your own institutional strategic plan to see if the word integrity appears or not. It's an interesting exercise. But anyway, I want to really raise a particular issue with us today, which is we have a problem. And that problem is called contract cheating. It's an awkward term, it's not a popular term, but it is the term that we use. And it's when a student gets someone else to produce academic work on their behalf and then submits it to an educational institution as if it were their own work. Make sure that you notice that the lack of payment isn't an issue here when we're talking about contract cheating. It doesn't matter whether it's paid or unpaid. And I'll list here the 5 sectors of the problem as I see them, listed in what I believe to be size order. First of all, friends and family, parents, girlfriends, boyfriends, rugby mates, Secondly, academic custom writing sites, and they really form into two great big groups, the two-sided markets and the writing purchase sites. Legitimate learning sites, note-sharing sites, file-sharing sites, micro-tutoring sites and so forth. Legitimate non-learning sites, perfectly legitimate sites like eBay, Airtasker, Rent-A-Coder, Facebook, Instagram and so forth. And finally, paid exam takers, both real, like live, or proxy exam takers. And I believe that's the size order of the problem because it's based on my own research investigation. And I also want to take you back in time to 2014 and to the MyMaster scandal. Here, in the show of hands, who was involved in the MyMaster scandal in the room? A couple of tentative hands going up. It was not a pleasant time for any of us to be on the front page of the paper for quite a prolonged period of time. But I think it's really interesting to see that that rather ignominious league table there on the right-hand side. I think at the time those of us who were on that league table felt remarkably unlucky to be there. But in fact, looking back on it now, I actually see that those of us who were there were remarkably lucky because we had a wake-up call that I think has held us in really good stead. But I also want to draw attention to the fact that since MyMaster occurred, there's been a huge volume of research that's been conducted. And this is an infographic that you may have seen that came out of the student workshop that I ran with Wendy Sutherland-Smith on Tuesday with the students, where she and Phil Dawson gave a whistle-stop tour of some of the incredible research that's come out from Australia since the MyMaster scandal. And I also want to call out some colleagues who are here in the room today who've contributed to that research, including Anne Rogerson, Beck Audrey, but Nick Milne's here as well. Wendy Sutherland-Smith and Phil Dawson are not here, but I also acknowledge the work of Tracy Brettag, who's been an extraordinary leader of this across the country and internationally, Rowena Harper and Margot McNeil, who's also here today. So the other thing that you might see on some of the stands outside is the infographic that's been produced by Tracy and colleagues for TEXA. I really strongly commend you get a hold of this. It's an excellent 2 sides of A4 that really showcases some of the excellent findings that have come out of the research. And in particular, I draw your attention to the footnotes that are on the flip side to this. It's really important for us to remember that this should be fed by good research, peer-reviewed empirical evidence that supports what we do, rather than relying on anecdote and guesswork. And I'm actually going to start with one of the research findings that's come out of the research that I've been involved with, and it's on that infographic, that 6% of students admit to having engaged in one or more contract cheating behaviours. This was from a survey of 14,000 students. Now, do the maths in your head. How many would this be at your institution? How many would this be nationally and internationally? And I would argue, and Anne Rogerson has just argued for this in a previous session, that 6% should be, if you like, our plimsoll line for detection. We really should be aiming for that kind of target to get a sense of where we're actually getting towards 100% detection. There's other evidence that I want to share with you about the volume of contract cheating behaviours. This is just one example. It's just SA Shark. It's only one of thousands of sites. It's a 2-sided market, works a bit like eBay, where the writers and the customers star rate each other, and they give each other a star rating out of 10. This is a writer called Blasi. It's not actually Blasi, that's a photograph of a gentleman called Liam who sings for a popular music band called One Direction that the young people are listening to. I think actually this is a consortium of writers. So if you like, it's a little mini contract cheating company that's running in SA Shark. He's got quite a few medals for his work. But you'll notice here, of course, that at the top we've got business, we've got some humanities stuff. Oops, sorry, I've gone one too far. But the big number that you can see is 155,921,989 orders have been processed by SA Shark, which is up 33 million from this time last year. By anybody's reckoning, that's a big number. It's just one example of the volume of this work. So, now I want to turn to think about the difference between incidence and detection. And can I just call out to all of the journalists in the room, please make an effort to understand the difference between these two things. It's one of the big problems we're seeing in reporting at the moment. An increase in detection does not mean an increase in incidence. So by incidence, I mean an instance where contract cheating has actually occurred, where a student has purchased something and submitted it for assessment, regardless of whether they've been detected or not. Detection is when we've actually run the investigation and upheld the allegation, and that is when I say we get to a point of detection. The problem we've got, however, is that we have got a gap between these two things. Basically, you've seen the volume of the amount of orders that are happening, and it's happening under our noses, and it's going largely undetected. But the problem that we face with this gap is that this will not diminish until this starts to increase. We need to get better at detection. Now, I'm not advocating for us to take our foot off the pedal of deterrence, but we do need to now start putting some of our energies into detection. And this is actually starting to be picked up by the media. This was a Channel 4 article or story that ran earlier this year, where they made a very strong point about the difference between what they believe is the incidence, which is the red line on the top, and the amount of detection, which is the red line on the bottom. Look, the maths that they did were a little bit ropey, but the gap is probably about that large. Again, some more research findings. That we surveyed over 1,100 academic staff about their experiences of contract cheating. Roughly 2/3 of the respondents reported that they had marked a piece of work that they suspected hadn't been written by the student, but only 1/3 of them went on to report that suspicion to an academic integrity decision maker. Why? Well, we asked them that as well. By far and away, the biggest reason that was given was that it's considered to be impossible to prove. That is something that we need to face up to. I would argue today, and we've heard from other colleagues today, it is not impossible to prove, and in fact, there are lots of examples going on at the moment of making it quite easy to prove. Another really important finding, and again, this is on the infographic, there were three main things that correlated between student behaviours and student cheating behaviours and their other factors. And one of the factors was that the students who saw lots of opportunities to cheat were more likely to engage in contract cheating behaviours. But from my point of view, that is the single most obvious opportunity to cheat is that we currently have no or low detection. It is absolutely having an impact on the student's perception. When you think about it, contract cheating is designed to evade detection. Like tax evasion, it depends for its efficacy on not being detected. And this will affect students' risk appetite, and worse still, may give students the false impression that we're turning a blind eye to it, or worse still, we're condoning it. And that's something that we need to take quite seriously. The good news, detection, oh goodness, sorry. This is really great fun. Okay. Detection can be improved. And again, I'm drawing on some research findings here, not my own this time. This is research that's been conducted by Phil Dawson and Wendy Sutherland-Smith from Deakin, absolute powerhouse of research in this area. And they have found that awareness raising, the training of markers and using of tools such as Turnitin's authorship tool, their new tool, which was the one that they actually tested for this paper, do have a positive impact on the capacity for academic staff to detect contract cheating. But remember, the evidence is also hiding in plain sight. In the MyMaster case, in an article that was published the following year, Lisa Vizentin reminded us that the data was insecurely stored on the now-defunct MyMaster website. We have to work from the assumption that this is not going to be the last instance of a MyMaster-type scandal. And I think we also have to appreciate that something like MyMaster will happen again. This is not a what if, but a when. This is, from a risk management perspective, a reasonably foreseeable risk. If you have not taken the lesson from MyMaster at your institution and changed the way that you approach contract cheating, and another MyMaster scandal happens again and it affects your institution, then you're going to look rather foolish when you haven't taken the opportunity to learn from that crisis. So now I want to turn to the question of partnership. and particularly the partnership that Anthony introduced us to in his keynote presentation at the beginning of this conference. Academic integrity is at the top of their list, of TEXA's list of key priority areas, and I'm really, really pleased to see that. But he also advocated for this to be a partnership between higher education providers and TEXA as our regulator. And I want to be absolutely clear that this is not just a higher education problem, and it's not just an Australian problem. It is absolutely happening in other countries as well, and it is also happening in high schools. Dear Lord, it's happening in primary schools. It's happening in TAFE and VET. It's happening in military colleges, and when you think about the blackmail risk, I'll just let that one sink in. It's happening in theological colleges. Again, I'll let that one sink in. It's also happening in accrediting bodies. But I think that one of the reasons why this partnership is going to be so important, we just can't say that it's a partnership. We actually have to make it a partnership. And the meaningful partnership that I think will be here between us as higher education providers and TEXA as our higher education regulator is that we are the research-led educational sector. We can provide empirical evidence upon which good decisions can be made about investigative approaches. And after all, our core business is expanding knowledge, both through our research and our teaching and learning. It is absolutely at the heart of what we do. So I want to turn now to think about partnership and also leadership. The higher education providers should provide leadership for other educational providers that are similarly affected by this problem. So too should the higher education regulators provide leadership for the regulators of the other educational sectors who are affected by this problem. We should and must take the leadership on this. Now, in terms of detection approaches, there are emerging many different dozens and hopefully hundreds of different approaches. And you will have heard from Nick Milne at Deakin earlier today, if you attended our session, that he's developed some interesting approaches at Deakin as well. But there are many more than we could possibly pursue. We have a finite amount of time, energy and resources to put to this. So I would like to advocate for us prioritising detection approaches that are highly probative, that are scalable and sustainable, that address contract cheating behaviours in both STEM and HASS disciplines, and this is my absolute priority, that smash the business models of contract cheating providers. We've got to get away from this being an arms race and a whack-a-mole situation, and we need to understand the industry that is behind this to really understand how we can exploit their vulnerabilities and their weak points in order to make sure that we're actually making it unviable for them to provide these services. We also need to, it's doing some weird things, sorry about this. We also need to have a look at the other reasons why academic staff are telling us that they are not reporting their suspicions. We need to address these perverse incentives not to report. And if you're a senior leader at a university, I encourage you to take note of some of the key themes that are emerging here. We need to address the perverse incentives, but also make the policy and procedures that we've got fit for purpose. I think that a lot of the policies and procedures that we've got at the moment were perfectly straightforwardly functional for plagiarism circa 2005, but they're no longer working for the type of plagiarism that's happening now in 2019. They need to be easy to use, and again, on the infographic that is around, they need to be subject to regular review. The practices of cheating behaviours are changing, our policies and procedures need to change as well. So, my final messages. This needs to be taken seriously. It's a must-have, not a good-to-have, to address the problem of contract cheating. This needs to be properly resourced and supported. I would really strongly recommend you centralise the investigative and administrative compliance function for academic integrity maintenance at your institution. Make this someone's job, not an optional extra on somebody else's job. Give these people tools to make them more efficient and effective, and there are some great tools entering the market that will at the very least save these people a huge amount of time. Find your academic staff who are passionate about this and support and reward them. Trust me, they're in your institution right now, beavering away at this, but this is not something that will appear on their promotion application. This is not something that will appear on their appraisal conversation with their senior management. Make that happen. And can I go back a slide, whoever's controlling this? My final call out, this needs courage. It's a hallmark of integrity to be able to act with courage. If you're a senior leader, you need to take courage, but it also needs deeds, not just words. It's not enough to stand there and say, we take academic integrity seriously. You actually have to follow that through with actions. So I remind you of the My Master situation and encourage you to think, post My Master, are you in better shape than before it? Now, I hope you understand that today I'm not speaking on behalf of the University of New South Wales, but I'm very, very proud to be an employee and to work for the University of New South Wales. And from my position as an academic staff member and integrity officer of the University of New South Wales, I think we're in good shape. And that's largely due to the leadership of the DVCA, Professor Merlin Crossley, our Director of Integrity, Bronwyn Green, our Director of the Student Conduct and Integrity Unit, Kimberly Dickinson, and in particular two of her staff, David House and Kane Murdoch. And I really want to acknowledge the work of all of those people and the change that they've made to my institution. But I want to leave you with one final question. As a university, are you able to hold together under a load of contract cheating, including your own weight, functioning as a university without breaking or deforming excessively? Can you continue to function for your design purpose during reasonable use for your intended lifespan? And I also encourage you to think about what catastrophic failure would mean to you as a university if you were to let the standards of academic integrity slip. So I want to leave you with one final question. If I can click it through. It's a great question. Do you have structural integrity?
Okay, follow that. Thanks to Texa for inviting me over here. As I said, my name is Padraig Walsh. It was relatively easy to travel thousands of kilometres to get from Dublin to Melbourne. It's more difficult getting people to understand how to pronounce my forename, but we'll work on that. Okay. QQI is the national body for quality assurance of both vocational and higher education. So we deal with further education and training and English language education. So we're genuinely a tertiary education body. We were established in 2012, but on establishment we found out fairly quickly that our legislation was quite vulnerable in terms of our ability in taking in new providers, what powers we had to be able to take them in. So we recognised that it needed to be strengthened. We're a common law country, which means we don't do legislation that frequency. We have a Universities Act that dates back to 1997. The previous one occurred in 1908 when we were still part of the United Kingdom. So we decided to take the opportunity when the amending legislation was going to be looked at to look at a number of things that we needed to do. And one was to look at the area of contract cheating. We had no idea necessarily that there were any public disclosures on the use of, say, essay mills by Irish learners, but we weren't naive enough to think that the issues that had come up in my master, which we'd looked at, and had looked at what the New Zealanders had done in terms of that. So in July of this year, new legislation was passed to enhance our powers and to give us a range of new functions. And one specifically, there's a section of our Act about the prosecution of those who facilitate academic misconduct. So we're the first country in Europe that has put this into primary legislation. I said we're not the first in the world. New Zealand looked at this before us. If you go back to the Bible, the sixth commandment says don't cheat. The ninth commandment says don't even think about cheating. So this isn't entirely new, okay? So a number of sections of the Act were commenced on the 5th of November. So the legislation I've gone through, it actually has to be commenced in individual parts. What does the legislation do? There are 9 sections in it under 4 main headings. Impersonation, so it's an offence to undertake work. It's an offence to sit an exam in place of a learner. The provision of cheating services, it's an offence to provide answers to during the course of an exam. before an exam to provide answers, or to provide or arrange the provision of an assignment. The advertising of cheating services, it's an offence to advertise the provision of assignments, and it's an offence to advertise the undertaking of assignments on behalf of a learner. And the fourth part, public advertising for services, it's an offence to publish an advert for the provision of exam answers, to publish an advert for the provision of assignments. And the penalties can range from fines up to €100,000 or a prison sentence of up to 5 years. Two things to note. The legislation doesn't penalise the student who's done the cheating. Cheating in itself is not a criminal act, and cheating will still be subject to the normal academic sanctions within institutions. Secondly, while technically the way the legislation is phrased allows for the prosecution of other learners, friends and family, anyone who facilitates cheating, the Department of Education, who were responsible for sponsoring the Act, made it clear that that was not the intention. Rather, the legislation was really intended to address organised, for-profit entities that were targeting learners, or the essay mills as they're colloquially termed. And we had to go and look at getting legal advice on this, and I'll run through that quickly at the end. We need a national approach, as Cath has said, and an international approach to look at addressing this misconduct. One of the principles of the European Standards and Guidelines, which work across the 48-member European higher education area, is that the primary responsibility for quality rests with institutions, and all staff share that responsibility. The last thing we wanted to happen was for institutions to start abdicating the responsibility and to throw it back onto QQI. That would be nonsensical. We don't have the resource to do it. And as Cath has pointed out, the research-informed bodies, the people that know that this is going on and have to work with it, are the institutions themselves. So we fully understand that we have to step in and work with the institutions on a partnership basis within this. We don't intend pursuing legal cases on a regular basis. This is not the first offence legislation that we have. It's an offence to claim that you have an award from QQI or that you offer awards that are accredited by QQI. It's an offence to claim that a qualification that you offer in Ireland is in the Irish National Framework of Qualifications, if it isn't. To date, we haven't had to prosecute this, but it does help when we either have to send letters to bodies that are purporting to be able to do this, often innocently, and many times not innocently. And we've managed to get the majority of that information taken down simply by pointing out to people that they're committing an offence by doing so. What are we going to do about this? How are we going to actually introduce the legislation? We're going to look at 4 steps around it. We're going to look at enhancement, communication, national coordination, and international coordination. So on the enhancement, at a national level, we've convened a national academic integrity network, which had its first meeting on the 14th of November, and we had Cath Ellis over who spoke on that very helpfully. This complies as membership from all the public higher education institutions in Ireland. That's about 22, and the majority of the higher education institutions that have gone through a re-engagement or agreement of quality assurance procedures with QQI. We're going to look at things like developing a common lexicon around things, and we're going to convene specifically working groups to address key projects and assist QQI in the implementation of this. The institutions welcomed this. We had a very good turnout for this. It's a kind of a thing of knowing we all have this problem, and it's much better if we share it, and it's useless to try and do this on a silo basis. On the communication side, we need a strategy to be able to inform relevant stakeholders, need to identify the respective responsibilities for each groups, and we're going to look, for instance, at commencing formal communication with the major online platforms and advertisers to ensure that appropriate action can be taken to minimise the use. In many cases, this will be through the use of their own terms of service. Most of the players, Facebook, Google's, others that take up advertising, under the terms of service, they can carry an advert that's illegal. And once you point something out to do that, we're hoping that that will be able to do. It may help that the European headquarters for Google, Facebook and Twitter are within walking distance of my own office, which may be handy. So that's one of the things we're doing. On the communication side, no one ever writes that every day 1.5 million Irish people drive motor cars without an accident. But when people get killed, people report that. So QQI doesn't tend to make the newspapers. The only time that we've managed to get on Drive Time, which is the main evening radio programme, was in relation to the seminar that we had. We had interviews with the main national newspapers, and a lot of this actually helps in bringing up the information to people around this. On the national coordination side, it's not just our responsibility. Dealing with advertising and publication of adverts will require liaison with other state bodies, which will include our Advertising Standards Authority, with our Department of Business, Enterprise and Innovation. International cooperation, there's no respect for boundaries or borders, seas or land on this. SAMILs operate across jurisdictions. It's particularly prone, as we've seen, in the Anglosphere. So we're in that, just like the UK, just like Australia, New Zealand, the United States. If we want to achieve meaningful impact on this, we'll require cooperation beyond what we were. The world's a big place, but quality assurance around the world is not. It's a relatively small group of people. When people ask me for what I did for a living, I said I travel all over the world meeting the same people. While I'm speaking here, one of my colleagues is in Prague in the Czech Republic speaking at a Council of Europe platform on the same topic. And what they're doing is looking at a draft Council of Europe policy framework called Countering Education Fraud and Promoting Ethics, Transparency and Integrity in Education. So the European higher education area, the wider 48-member group, has recognised that this is a problem as well. We had close cooperation on all quality assurance matters with the Quality Assurance Agency in the UK. When Anthony was Chief Executive there, we used to meet every 6 months because we have matters of mutual interest that we work at. When he moved to TEXA, we still kept up that cooperation. And tomorrow we're going to sign an MOU in relation to this because we recognise that cooperation between regulators is very important, that we share information, that this is really a worldwide problem that we have to work on. In the remaining minute or so that I have, just to talk a little about the type of legal advice that we've got. One of the things we were worried about was that does the commencement of the particular section impose an automatic obligation on providers to report offences? In other words, does every university, every instance have to start telling QQI that they have a problem? And the answer we got back is no, there isn't a general legal obligation to report information in Irish law. There are specific exceptions that have to be written into law around things like child sexual abuse, for instance, but in general, there isn't a requirement to do that. The other is in terms of trying to look at a threshold for doing this, and we have to, in most normal cases, look at the idea that it's not in the interest to pursue individual learners on a small basis, or when the prospect of bringing a case is small, or from the benefits from a successful case are outweighed by the cost in bringing it. So we have to have discretion in that. We have to have a delineation, but we're not going to write out what that is. The advice is that that would fetter the discretion that we have, and that doesn't make sense. One of the examples that were given is that we've always been dealing with cheating, and universities have been dealing with cheating over time. Now that it's an offence, does this mean that we have to bring this into a criminal phase? And the advice that we got on that will be to look at employment situations. An employee may be fired for stealing after a proper employment investigation and disciplinary hearing, but there is no requirement to report that to the police of them ever being informed of the incident. There's no requirement other than that the disciplinary hearing ascertain that the employee committed the theft. So we do these things all, and we've been doing them anyway. So the idea really is not to transfer that, to big the whole thing up. And the other really is at what stage should the providers provide notice? Should be when it's suspected, when an internal investigation has commenced, when it's clear that cheating has occurred, or when the appeals procedures are exhausted. So on an ABCD, we feel probably somewhere between B and C, maybe closer to C, is there what's on that. So that's a quick run through of what we haven't done anything on it to date, other than the information side, but obviously having it in legislation is something that we feel is useful. Thanks very much.
Thank you. I've been generously invited to share with you quite a subjective lived experience of those of us who are working in institutions trying to overcome this problem. And I think the challenge that many institutions face really is that of conflicting sentiments. On the one hand, we see and empathise with our students' experience entirely. Oftentimes, they engage in contract cheating simply because they see no other way out. They're working too many hours in a job that's physically and emotionally taxing, or they're struggling with English such that upon leaving their assessment to complete until the last day, they suddenly panic when they realise they no longer have the capacity to complete it. So as institutions, we genuinely do understand and empathise with their situation. Our students are trying to balance life with study, sometimes without enough success. On the other hand, though, we as institutions are acutely aware of our own credibility, which is at risk as a sector. The prevalence of contract cheating, should it not be deterred, risks deteriorating in the most profound way the integrity of our sector. And if both our credibility and our integrity are sacrificed, our viability then as an industry might also diminish, since the perception of our qualifications in what is now a truly global market for education may be seen as less valuable. So in essence, we're balancing empathy with resoluteness. That balance also plays out in the way we manage cases of contract cheating when they're detected. And I do emphasise when they're detected because, as we know too well, we are only detecting a small proportion of academic misconduct. Sometimes contract cheating is very easy to detect. At my school, for example, there was a case where one of our lecturers was marking a paper, and it was a very good paper, only for him to get halfway through and for the essay to suddenly stop. And what appeared was a message that said, to receive the rest of this essay, please pay the outstanding balance. So that was an example of a very easy case to detect. In most cases, though, it's much tougher and usually relies on lecturers to know their students well. If that lecturer happens to be working at an institution populated mostly by international students, like my own, a common signal is when they come across a paper that reads as though it were written by a Rhodes Scholar. Immediately alarm bells would go off, thereby triggering an investigation of some sort. But at institutions that are more diverse, where class sizes are perhaps not 20 or 30, but more like 200 or 300, it's less easy for a lecturer to be able to know their students well enough to detect when a submitted paper is not their own. The balance that's required then is that of efficiency versus effectiveness, with the latter, effectiveness, often sacrificed, with the consequence, of course, being that there's now a greater opportunity for contract cheating to occur. And there's a further issue of balance too, and that is one that pertains to the lecturer's time. Many institutions, especially smaller ones, do not have the resources to dedicate, for example, to sufficiently staffed academic integrity teams. The onus is therefore on the lecturer, many of whom, probably most of whom, are employed as casuals, to not only investigate the act of contract cheating, but also to conduct the interview and then to determine the penalty. So if they're not being paid for that extra work, thereby resulting in an imbalance between their effort and their remuneration, it's easy to see why so many may pretend that it's not happening, to sweep the issue under the carpet. Another factor requiring balance is that of education versus discipline. How much education must we provide students on academic integrity? How much of that should be mandatory? Should they be forgiven if it's a first offence, if they went through that training? What happens if it's the second offence? Is there a point at which we have to cancel their enrolment if it continues happening? These are all questions that every institution either has or is grappling with as they seek to gain control of this issue. And of course, in the centre of it all is the student who may now be balancing the need to evade detection from their educator, while at the same time now trying to unexpectedly deal with threats of blackmail from the SML that they bought their paper from. So you can probably tell from my conclusion, which is not at all empirical like Cath's, that it's characterised by balance, or rather imbalance, among institutions and students. And until that balance returns, it may be some time before this issue is resolved. Though I know I speak on behalf of many institutions when I say we've welcomed the government's proposed legislation to make it an offence for an organisation to promote or advertise contract cheating services. And over the past year, I've been privileged to be a member of a working group led by the Department of Education, tasked with developing a statement of academic integrity that all institutions will hopefully adopt, that will require their students to sign this statement of academic integrity as a commitment to studying ethically. And there's also hope for balance in terms of the potential for collaboration between institutions and regulators. And for that reason, I will now shift this conversation to Cath and Padraig, both of whom are experts on this in ways that I am not. However, we are left with 2 minutes. So, I'm going to ask one question based upon those that have been submitted online. And that question is, going back to the research that was mentioned in Cath's presentation, where 2/3 approximately of markers admitted that they are able to determine or suspect when contract cheating has occurred, and yet so few follow through with it. Why do you think that is, in 45 seconds or less, and what can be done about it?
Well, we know why it is because I showed a graph. So.
Okay, then what can be done about it?
I said that we need to address the perverse incentives to not report.
Okay, from your experience, Padraig?
The first experience I had of this was what you talked about, was as a casual when I came across this, and I just thought, is it worth doing this? Is it worth going through this process? Because I had no training in it whatsoever. So we have to make it easier for people to do this and to know that it's responsible part of your job to do it. Otherwise, we're just all hiding, and we're never going to solve this.
55 seconds left, so we'll throw in one more question about the comment made in regards to smashing the business models of contract cheating providers. How could we do that knowing that so many of them are actually based offshore where they might not be able to be reached by legislation?
That's more than 36 seconds worth of an answer. But I think the quick answer to that is that we need to understand the business models that are at work. Yes, a lot of them are offshore. They're happening, a lot of them in former British colonial nations where there is a large enough supply of well enough educated, underemployed graduates who are in their 20s and 30s who need to make some extra cash. It's a hustle, it's a side thing. We need to start thinking about how we can actually exploit the vulnerabilities that are at work in those business models. But also, I think that this is where the legislation that Ireland have enacted and that Australia is hoping to enact can actually play a part. And I want to return to a point that Padraig made. QQI don't want to have the higher education providers abnegating responsibility of the academic compliance or the academic integrity compliance function to them. And the higher education providers don't want to have to go after the contract cheating providers. We need to divvy up this responsibility so that companies like SA Shark can be stopped at the border.
Thank you, Cath. Thank you, Padraig. Thank you, everybody.